Chapter 19 of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Black Despair. "Ah," said Zataras, "to what kindly circumstance am I indebted for the pleasure of this unexpected visit from the Prince of Helium?" While he was speaking, one of my guards had removed the gag from my mouth, but I made no reply to Zataras, simply standing there in silence with level gaze fixed upon the Jed of Zaranga. And I doubt not that my expression was colored by the contempt I felt for the man. The eyes of those within the chamber were fixed first upon me and then upon Zataras, until finally a flush of anger crept slowly over his face. "You may go," he said to those who had brought me. And when only his two companions and ourselves were left in the chamber, he spoke to me again in a voice of ice, very slowly and deliberately, with many pauses, as though he would choose his words cautiously. "John Carter," he said, "by the edict of custom, by the law of our religion, and by the verdict of an impartial court, you are condemned to die. The people cannot save you. I alone may accomplish that. You are absolutely in my power to do with as I wish. I may kill you, or I may free you. And should I elect to kill you, none would be the wiser. Should you go free in Helium for a year, in accordance with the conditions of your reprieve, there is little fear that the people would ever insist upon the execution of the sentence imposed upon you. You may go free within 2 minutes, upon one condition. Tardos Mors will never return to Helium. Neither will Mors Kajak, nor Jejathoris. Helium must select a new Jedak within the year. Zataras would be Jedak of Helium. Say that you will espouse my cause. This is the price of your freedom. I am done." I knew it was within the scope of Zataras' cruel heart to destroy me, and if I were dead, I could see little reason to doubt that he might easily become Jedak of Helium. Free, I could prosecute the search for Jejathoris. Were I dead, my brave comrades might not be able to carry out our plans. So, by refusing to accede to his request, it was quite probable that not only would I not prevent him from becoming Jedak of Helium, but that I would be the means of sealing Jejathoris' fate, of consigning her, through my refusal, to the horrors of the arena of Isis. For a moment I was perplexed, but for a moment only. The proud daughter of 1,000 Jedaks would choose death to a dishonorable alliance such as this, nor could John Carter do less for Helium than his princess would do. Then I turned to Zataras. "There can be no alliance," I said, "between a traitor to Helium and a prince of the house of Tardos Mors. I do not believe, Zataras, that the great Jedak is dead." Zataras shrugged his shoulders. "It will not be long, John Carter," he said, "that your opinions will be of interest, even to yourself. So make the best of them while you can. Zataras will permit you, in due time, to reflect further upon the magnanimous offer he has made you. Into the silence and darkness of the pits you will enter upon your reflection this night with the knowledge that should you fail within a reasonable time to agree to the alternative which has been offered you, never shall you emerge from the darkness and the silence again. Nor shall you know at what minute the hand will reach out through the darkness and the silence with the keen dagger that shall rob you of your last chance to win again the warmth and the freedom and joyousness of the outer world." Zataras clapped his hands as he ceased speaking. The guards returned. Zataras waved his hand in my direction. "To the pits," he said. That was all. 4 men accompanied me from the chamber, and with a radium hand light to illumine the way, escorted me through seemingly interminable tunnels, down, ever down, beneath the city of Helium. At length they halted within a fair-sized chamber. There were rings set in the rocky walls. To them chains were fastened, and at the ends of many of the chains were human skeletons. One of these they kicked aside, and unlocking the huge padlock that had held a chain about what had once been a human ankle, they snapped the iron band about my own leg. Then they left me, taking the light with them. Utter darkness prevailed. For a few minutes I could hear the clanking of accoutrements, but even this grew fainter and fainter, until at last the silence was as complete as the darkness. I was alone with my gruesome companions, with the bones of dead men whose fate was likely but the index of my own. How long I stood listening in the darkness I do not know, but the silence was unbroken, and at last I sunk to the hard floor of my prison, where, leaning my head against the stony wall, I slept. It must have been several hours later that I awakened to find a young man standing before me. In one hand he bore a light, in the other a receptacle containing a gruel-like mixture, the common prison fare of Barsoom. "Zat-Aras sends you greetings," said the young man, "and commands me to inform you that, though he is fully advised of the plot to make you Jeddak of Helium, he is, however, not inclined to withdraw the offer which he has made you. To gain your freedom, you have but to request me to advise Zat-Aras that you accept the terms of his proposition." I but shook my head. The youth said no more, and after placing the food upon the floor at my side, returned up the corridor, taking the light with him. Twice a day, for many days, this youth came to my cell with food, and ever the same greetings from Zat-Aras. For a long time I tried to engage him in conversation upon other matters, but he would not talk, and so at length I desisted. For months I sought to devise methods to inform Carthoris of my whereabouts. For months I scraped and scraped upon a single link of the massive chain which held me, hoping eventually to wear it through, that I might follow the youth back through the winding tunnels to a point where I could make a break for liberty. I was beside myself with anxiety for knowledge of the progress of the expedition which was to rescue Dejathoris. I felt that Carthoris would not let the matter drop, were he free to act. But in so far as I knew, he also might be a prisoner in Zat-Aras' pits. That Zat-Aras' spy had overheard our conversation relative to the selection of a new Jeddak I knew, and scarcely a half-dozen minutes prior we had discussed the details of the plan to rescue Dejathoris. The chances were that that matter, too, was well known to him. Carthoris, Kantos Khan, Tarkas, Vastus, and Zodar might even now be the victims of Zat-Aras' assassins, or else his prisoners. I determined to make at least one more effort to learn something, and to this end I adopted strategy when next the youth came to my cell. I had noticed that he was a handsome fellow, about the size and age of Carthoris, and I had also noticed that his shabby trappings but illy comported with his dignified and noble bearing. It was with these observations as a basis that I opened my negotiations with him upon his next subsequent visit. "You have been very kind to me during my imprisonment here," I said to him, "and as I feel that I have at best a very short time to live, I wish, ere it is too late, to furnish substantial testimony of my appreciation of all that you have done to render my imprisonment bearable. Promptly you have brought my food each day, seeing that it was pure and of sufficient quantity. Never by word or deed have you attempted to take advantage of my defenseless condition to insult or torture me. You have been uniformly courteous and considerate. It is this, more than any other thing, which prompts my feeling of gratitude and my desire to give you some slight token of it. In the guard-room of my palace are many fine trappings. Go thou there, and select the harness which most pleases you. It shall be yours. All I ask is that you wear it, that I may know that my wish has been realized. Tell me that you will do it." The boy's eyes had lighted with pleasure as I spoke, and I saw him glance from his rusty trappings to the magnificence of my own. For a moment he stood in thought before he spoke, and for that moment my heart fairly ceased beating. So much for me there was which hung upon the substance of his answer. and I went to the palace of the Prince of Helium with any such demand, they would laugh at me, and into the bargain would more than likely throw me head foremost into the avenue. No, it cannot be, though I thank you for the offer. Why, if Zataras even dreamed that I contemplated such a thing, he would have my heart cut out of me." "There can be no harm in it, my boy," I urged. "By night you may go to my palace, with a note from me to Carthoris, my son. You may read the note before you deliver it, that you may know that it contains nothing harmful to Zataras. My son will be discreet, and so none but us three need know. It is very simple, and such a harmless act that it could be condemned by no one." Again he stood silently in deep thought. "And there is a jeweled short sword which I took from the body of a northern Jeddak. When you get the harness, see that Carthoris gives you that also. With it, and the harness which you may select, there will be no more handsomely accoutred warrior in all Zodonga. Bring writing materials when you come next to my cell, and within a few hours we shall see you garbed in a style befitting your birth and carriage." Still in thought, and without speaking, he turned and left me. I could not guess what his decision might be, and for hours I sat fretting over the outcome of the matter. If he accepted a message to Carthoris, it would mean to me that Carthoris still lived and was free. If the youth returned wearing the harness and the sword, I would know that Carthoris had received my note, and that he knew that I still lived. That the bearer of the note was a Dodongan would be sufficient to explain to Carthoris that I was a prisoner of Zataras. It was with feelings of excited expectancy, which I could scarce hide, that I heard the youth's approach upon the occasion of his next regular visit. I did not speak beyond my accustomed greeting of him. As he placed the food upon the floor by my side, he also deposited writing materials at the same time. My heart fairly bounded for joy. I had won my point. For a moment I looked at the materials in feigned surprise, but soon I permitted an expression of dawning comprehension to come into my face, and then, picking them up, I penned a brief order to Carthoris to deliver to Parthak a harness of his selection and the short sword which I described. That was all, but it meant everything to me and to Carthoris. I laid the note open upon the floor. Parthak picked it up, and without a word left me. As nearly as I could estimate, I had at this time been in the pits for 300 days. If anything was to be done to save Dejothoris, it must be done quickly, for, were she not already dead, her end must come soon, since those whom Isis chose lived but a single year. The next time I heard approaching footsteps, I could scarce await to see if Parthak wore the harness and the sword, but judge, if you can, my chagrin and disappointment when I saw that he who bore my food was not Parthak. "What has become of Parthak?" I asked, but the fellow would not answer, and as soon as he had deposited my food, turned and retraced his steps to the world above. Days came and went, and still my new jailer continued his duties, nor would he ever speak a word to me, either in reply to the simplest question or of his own initiative. I could only speculate on the cause of Parthak's removal, but that it was connected in some way directly with the note I had given him was most apparent to me. After all my rejoicing, I was no better off than before, for now I did not even know that Carthoris lived. For if Parthak has wished to raise himself in the estimation of Zataras, he would have permitted me to go on precisely as I did, so that he could carry my note to his master, in proof of his own loyalty and devotion. 30 days had passed since I had given the youth the note. 330 days had passed since my incarceration. As closely as I could figure, there remained a bare 30 days ere Dejothoris would be ordered to the arena for the rites of Isis. As the terrible picture forced itself vividly across my imagination, I buried my face in my arms, and only with the greatest difficulty was it that I repressed the tears that welled to my eyes despite my every effort. To think of that beautiful creature torn and rended by the cruel fangs of the hideous white apes, It was unthinkable. Such a horrid fact could not be. And yet my reason told me that within 30 days my incomparable princess would be fought over in the arena of the firstborn by those very wild beasts, that her bleeding corpse would be dragged through the dirt and the dust until at last a part of it would be rescued to be served as food upon the tables of the black nobles. I think that I should have gone crazy but for the sound of my approaching jailer. It distracted my attention from the terrible thoughts that had been occupying my entire mind. Now a new and grim determination came to me. I would make one superhuman effort to escape, kill my jailer by a ruse, and trust to fate to lead me to the outer world in safety. With the thought came instant action. I threw myself upon the floor of my cell, close by the wall, in a strained and distorted posture, as though I were dead after a struggle or convulsions. When he should stoop over me, I had but to grasp his throat with one hand and strike him a terrific blow with the slack of my chain, which I gripped firmly in my right hand for the purpose. Nearer and nearer came the doomed man. Now I heard him halt before me. There was a muttered exclamation, and then a step as he came to my side. I felt him kneel beside me. My grip tightened upon the chain. He leaned close to me. I must open my eyes to find his throat, grasp it, and strike one mighty final blow all at the same instant. The thing worked just as I had planned. So brief was the interval between the opening of my eyes and the fall of the chain that I could not check it, though in that minute interval I recognized the face so close to mine as that of my son, Carthoris. God, what cruel and malign fate had worked to such a frightful end! What devious chain of circumstances had led my boy to my side at this one particular minute of our lives, when I could strike him down and kill him in ignorance of his identity? A benign, though tardy providence blurred my vision and my mind as I sank into unconsciousness across the lifeless body of my only son. When I regained consciousness, it was to feel a cool, firm hand pressed upon my forehead. For an instant I did not open my eyes. I was endeavoring to gather the loose ends of many thoughts and memories which flitted elusively through my tired and overwrought brain. At length came the cruel recollection of the thing that I had done in my last conscious act. And then I dared not to open my eyes for fear of what I should see lying beside me. I wondered who it could be who ministered to me. Carthoris must have had a companion whom I had not seen. Well, I must face the inevitable sometime, so why not now? And with a sigh I opened my eyes. Leaning over me was Carthoris, a great bruise upon his forehead where the chain had struck, but alive, thank God, alive. There was no one with him. Reaching out my arms, I took my boy within them, and if ever there arose from any planet a fervent prayer of gratitude, it was there beneath the crust of dying Mars, as I thanked the eternal mystery for my son's life. The brief instant in which I had seen and recognized Carthoris before the chain fell must have been ample to check the force of the blow. He told me that he had lain unconscious for a time. How long, he did not know. "How came you here at all?" I asked, mystified that he had found me without a guide. "It was by your wit in apprising me of your existence and imprisonment through the youth Parthak. Until he came for his harness and his sword, we had thought you dead. When I read your note, I did as you had bid, giving Parthak his choice of the harnesses in the guard-room, and later bringing the jeweled short-sword to him. But the minute that I had fulfilled the promise you evidently had made to him, my obligation to him ceased. Then I commenced to question him, but he would give me no information as to your whereabouts. He was intensely loyal to Zataras. Finally, I gave him a fair choice between freedom and the pits beneath the palace. The price of freedom, to be full information as to where you were imprisoned and directions which would lead us to you. But he still maintained his stubborn partisanship. Despairing, I had him removed to the pits. where he still is. No threats of torture or death, no bribes, however fabulous, would move him. His only reply to all our importunities was that whenever Parthak died, were it tomorrow or 1,000 years hence, no man could truly say a traitor is gone to his deserts. Finally, Zodar, who is a fiend for subtle craftiness, evolved a plan whereby we might worm the information from him. And so I had Horvastus to be harnessed in the metal of a Zodongan soldier, and chained in Parthak's cell beside him. For 15 days the noble Horvastus has languished in the darkness of the pits, but not in vain. Little by little he won the confidence and friendship of the Zodongan, until only today Parthak, thinking that he was speaking not only to a countryman, but to a dear friend, revealed to Horvastus the exact cell in which you lay. It took me but a short time to locate the plans of the pits of Helium among the official papers. To come to you, though, was a trifle more difficult matter. As you know, while all the pits beneath the city are connected, there are but single entrances from those beneath each section and its neighbor, and that at the upper level just underneath the ground. Of course, these openings, which lead from contiguous pits to those beneath government buildings, are always guarded. And so, while I easily came to the entrance to the pits beneath the palace which Zataris is occupying, I found there a Zodongan soldier on guard. There I left him when I had gone by, but his soul was no longer with him. And here I am, just in time to be nearly killed by you, he ended, laughing. As he talked, Carthoris had been working at the lock which held my fetters, and now, with an exclamation of pleasure, he dropped the end of the chain to the floor, and I stood up once more, freed from the galling irons I had chafed in for almost a year. He had brought a long sword and a dagger for me, and thus armed, we set out upon the return journey to my palace. At the point where we left the pits of Zataris, we found the body of the guard Carthoris had slain. It had not yet been discovered, and in order to still further delay search and mystify the Jed's people, we carried the body with us for a short distance, hiding it in a tiny cell off the main corridor of the pits, beneath an adjoining estate. Some half-hour later we came to the pits beneath our own palace, and soon thereafter emerged into the audience chamber itself, where we found Kantos Khan, Tarstarchus, Horvastus, and Zodar awaiting us most impatiently. No time was lost in fruitless recounting of my imprisonment. What I desired to know was how well the plans we had laid nearly a year ago had been carried out. "It has taken much longer than we had expected," replied Kantos Khan. "The fact that we were compelled to maintain utter secrecy has handicapped us terribly. Zataris spies are everywhere. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, no word of our real plans has reached the villain's ear. Tonight there lies about the great docks at Hastor a fleet of 1,000 of the mightiest battleships that ever sailed above Barsoom, and each equipped to navigate the air of Omine and the waters of Omine itself. Upon each battleship there are 5 10-man cruisers, and 10 5-man scouts, and 100 one-man scouts. In all, 116,000 craft, fitted with both air and water propellers. At Thark lie the transports for the green warriors of Tarstarchus, 900 large troop ships, and with them their convoys. 7 days ago all was in readiness, but we waited in the hope that by so doing your rescue might be encompassed in time for you to command the expedition. It is well we waited, my prince." "How is it, Tarstarchus," I asked, "that the men of Thark take not the accustomed action against one who returns from the bosom of ice?" "They sent a council of 50 chieftains to talk with me here," replied the Thark. "We are a just people, and when I told them the entire story, they were as one man in agreeing that their action toward me would be guided by the action of Helium toward John Carter. In the meantime, at their request, I was to resume my throne as Jeddak of Thark, that I might negotiate with neighboring hordes of warriors to compose the land forces of the expedition. I have done that which I agreed, 250,000 fighting men gathered from the ice cap at the north to the ice cap at the south, and representing 1,000 different communities from 100 wild and warlike hordes, fill the great city of Thark tonight. They are ready to sail for the land of the firstborn when I give the word, and fight there until I bid them stop. All they ask is the loot they take and transportation to their own territories when the fighting and the looting are over. I am done. And thou, Horvastus, I asked, what has been thy success? 1,000,000 veteran fighting men from Helium's thin waterways man the battleships, the transports, and the convoys, he replied. Each is sworn to loyalty and secrecy, nor were enough recruited from a single district to cause suspicion. Good, I cried. Each has done his duty. And now, Kantos Khan, may we not repair at once to Hastor and get under way before tomorrow's sun? We should lose no time, Prince, replied Kantos Khan. Already the people of Hastor are questioning the purpose of so great a fleet, fully manned with fighting men. I wonder much that the word of it has not before reached Zataris. A cruiser awaits above at your own dock. Let us leave it. A fusillade of shots from the palace gardens just without cut short his further words. Together we rushed to the balcony, in time to see a dozen members of my palace guard disappear in the shadows of some distant shrubbery, as in pursuit of one who fled. Directly beneath us, upon the scarlet sward, a handful of guardsmen were stooping above a still and prostrate form. While we watched, they lifted the figure in their arms, and at my command bore it to the audience chamber where we had been in council. When they stretched the body at our feet, we saw that it was that of a red man in the prime of life. His metal was plain, such as common soldiers wear, or those who wish to conceal their identity. Another of Zataris' spies, said Horvastus. So it would seem, I replied, and then to the guard, you may remove the body. Wait, said Zodar. If you will, Prince, ask that a cloth and a little thoat oil be brought. I nodded to one of the soldiers, who left the chamber, returning presently with the things that Zodar had requested. The black kneeled beside the body and, dipping a corner of the cloth in the thoat oil, rubbed for a moment on the dead face before him. Then he turned to me with a smile, pointing to his work. I looked and saw that where Zodar had applied the thoat oil, the face was white as mine. And then Zodar seized the black hair of the corpse, and with a sudden wrench tore it all away, revealing a hairless pate beneath. Guardsmen and nobles pressed close about the silent witness upon the marble floor. Many were the exclamations of astonishment and questioning wonder, as Zodar's act confirmed the suspicion which he had held. A Thurn, whispered Tars Tarkas. Worse than that, I fear, replied Zodar, but let us see. With that, he drew his dagger and cut open a locked pouch which had dangled from the Thurn's harness, and from it he brought forth a circlet of gold set with a large gem. It was the mate to that which I had taken from Sator Throg. He was a holy Thurn, said Zodar. Fortunate indeed it is for us that he did not escape. The officer of the guard entered the chamber at this juncture. My prince, he said, I have to report that this fellow's companion escaped us. I think that it was with the connivance of one or more of the men at the gate. I have ordered them all under arrest. Zodar handed him the thoat oil and cloth. With this you may discover the spy among you, he said. I at once ordered a secret search within the city, for every Martian noble maintains a secret service of his own. A half hour later, the officer of the guard came again to report. This time it was to confirm our worst fears. Half the guards at the gate that night had been Thurns disguised as red men. Come, I cried. We must lose no time. On to Hastor at once. Should the Thurns attempt to check us at the southern verge of the ice cap, it may result in the wrecking of all our plans and the total destruction of the expedition. 10 minutes later, we were speeding through the night toward Hastor, prepared to strike the first blow for the preservation of Dejathoris. End of chapter 19. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 20 of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Air Battle. 2 hours after leaving my palace at Helium, or about midnight, Kantos Khan, Zodar, and I arrived at Hastor. Carthoris, Tarstarchus, and Horvastus had gone directly to Thark upon another cruiser. The transports were to get under way immediately and move slowly south. The fleet of battleships would overtake them on the morning of the second day. At Hastor we found all in readiness, and so perfectly had Kantos Khan planned every detail of the campaign that within 10 minutes of our arrival the first of the fleet had soared aloft from its dock, and thereafter, at the rate of 1 a second, the great ships floated gracefully out into the night to form a long, thin line which stretched for miles toward the south. It was not until after we had entered the cabin of Kantos Khan that I thought to ask the date, for up to now I was not positive how long I had lain in the pits of Zat-Aras. When Kantos Khan told me, I realized with a pang of dismay that I had misreckoned the time while I lay in the utter darkness of my cell. 365 days had passed. It was too late to save Dejathoris. The expedition was no longer one of rescue, but of revenge. I did not remind Kantos Khan of the terrible fact that ere we could hope to enter the temple of Isis, the princess of Helium would be no more. Insofar as I knew, she might be already dead, for I did not know the exact date on which she first viewed Isis. What now the value of burdening my friends with my added personal sorrows? They had shared quite enough of them with me in the past. Hereafter I would keep my grief to myself, and so I said nothing to any other of the fact that we were too late. The expedition could yet do much, if it could but teach the people of Barsoom the facts of the cruel deception that had been worked upon them for countless ages, and thus save thousands each year from the horrid fate that awaited them at the conclusion of the voluntary pilgrimage. If it could open to the red men the fair Valley Dor, it would have accomplished much, and in the land of lost souls between the mountains of oats and the ice barrier were many broad acres that needed no irrigation to bear rich harvests. Here, at the bottom of a dying world, was the only naturally productive area upon its surface. Here alone were dews and rains. Here alone was an open sea. Here was water in plenty, and all this was but the stamping ground of fierce brutes, and from its beauteous and fertile expanse the wicked remnants of 2 once mighty races barred all the other millions of Barsoom. Could I but succeed in once breaking down the barrier of religious superstition which had kept the red races from this Eldorado, it would be a fitting memorial to the immortal virtues of my princess. I should have again served Barsoom, and Dejathoris' martyrdom would not have been in vain. On the morning of the second day we raised the great fleet of transports and their consorts at the first flood of dawn, and soon were near enough to exchange signals. I may mention here that radio aerograms are seldom if ever used in wartime, or for the transmission of secret dispatches at any time, for as often as one nation discovers a new cipher or invents a new instrument for wireless purposes, its neighbors bend every effort until they are able to intercept and translate the messages. For so long a time has this gone on that practically every possibility of wireless communication has been exhausted, and no nation dares transmit dispatches of importance in this way. Tarstarchus reported all well with the transports. The battleships passed through to take an advanced position, and the combined fleets moved slowly over the ice cap, hugging the surface closely to prevent detection by the Therns whose land we were approaching. Far in advance of all, a thin line of one-man air scouts protected us from surprise, and on either side they flanked us, while a smaller number brought up the rear some 20 miles behind the transports. In this formation, we had progressed toward the entrance of Omine for several hours, when one of our scouts returned from the front to report that the cone-like summit of the entrance was in sight. At almost the same instant, another scout from the left flank came racing toward the flagship. His very speed bespoke the importance of his information. Kantos Khan and I awaited him upon the little forward deck which corresponds with the bridge of earthly battleships. Scarcely had his tiny flyer come to rest upon the broad landing deck of the flagship ere he was bounding up the stairway to the deck where we stood. "A great fleet of battleships, south-southeast, my prince," he cried. "There must be several thousands, and they are bearing down directly upon us." "The Thurn spies were not in the palace of John Carter for nothing," said Kantos Kan to me. "Your orders, Prince." "Dispatch 10 battleships to guard the entrance to Amin, with orders to let no hostile enter or leave the shaft. That will bottle up the great fleet of the firstborn. Form the balance of the battleships into a great V, with the apex pointing directly south-southeast. Order the transports, surrounded by their convoys, to follow closely in the wake of the battleships until the point of the V has entered the enemy's line. Then the V must open outward at the apex. The battleships of each leg engage the enemy fiercely and drive him back to form a lane through his line, into which the transports with their convoys must race at top speed, that they may gain a position above the temples and gardens of the Thurns. Here let them land, and teach the holy Thurns such a lesson in ferocious warfare as they will not forget for countless ages. It had not been my intention to be distracted from the main issue of the campaign, but we must settle this attack with the Thurns once and for all, or there will be no peace for us while our fleet remains near Dor, and our chances of ever returning to the outer world will be greatly minimized." Kantos Kan saluted and turned to deliver my instructions to his waiting aides. In an incredibly short space of time, the formation of the battleships changed in accordance with my commands. The 10 that were to guard the way to Amin were speeding toward their destination, and the troop ships and convoys were closing up in preparation for the spurt through the lane. The order of full speed ahead was given. The fleet sprang through the air like coursing greyhounds, and in another moment the ships of the enemy were in full view. They formed a ragged line as far as the eye could reach in either direction, and about 3 ships deep. So sudden was our onslaught that they had no time to prepare for it. It was as unexpected as lightning from a clear sky. Every phase of my plan worked splendidly. Our huge ships mowed their way entirely through the line of Thurn battlecraft. Then the V opened up, and a broad lane appeared, through which the transports leaped toward the temples of the Thurns, which could now be plainly seen glistening in the sunlight. By the time the Thurns had rallied from the attack, 100,000 green warriors were already pouring through their courts and gardens, while 150,000 others leaned from low-swinging transports to direct their almost uncanny marksmanship upon the Thurn soldiery that manned the ramparts or attempted to defend the temples. Now the 2 great fleets closed in a titanic struggle far above the fiendish din of battle in the gorgeous gardens of the Thurns. Slowly the 2 lines of Helium's battleships joined their ends, and then commenced the circling within the line of the enemy, which is so marked a characteristic of Barsoomian naval warfare. Around and around in each other's tracks moved the ships under Kantos Kan, until at length they formed nearly a perfect circle. By this time they were moving at high speed, so that they presented a difficult target for the enemy. Broadside after broadside they delivered, as each vessel came in line with the ships of the Thurns. The latter attempted to rush in and break up the formation, but it was like stopping a buzzsaw with the bare hand. From my position on the deck beside Kantos Kan, I saw ship after ship of the enemy take the awful, sickening dive which proclaims its total destruction. Slowly we maneuvered our circle of death until we hung above the gardens where our green warriors were engaged. The order was passed down for them to embark. Then they rose slowly to a position within the center of the circle. In the meantime, the Thurns' fire had practically ceased. They had had enough of us, and were only too glad to let us go on our way in peace. But our escape was not to be encompassed with such ease, for scarcely had we gotten under way once more in the direction of the entrance to Amin, than we saw far to the north a great black line topping the horizon. It could be nothing other than a fleet of war. Whose or whither bound we could not even conjecture. When they had come close enough to make us out at all, Kantos Kan's operator received a radio aerogram, which he immediately handed to my companion. He read the thing and handed it to me. "Kantos Kan," it read, "surrender in the name of the Jeddak of Helium, for you cannot escape," and it was signed Zat Aras. The Therns must have caught and translated the message almost as soon as did we, for they immediately renewed hostilities when they realized that we were soon to be set upon by other enemies. Before Zat Aras had approached near enough to fire a shot, we were again hotly engaged with the Thern fleet, and as soon as he drew near, he too commenced to pour a terrific fusillade of heavy shot into us. Ship after ship reeled and staggered into uselessness beneath the pitiless fire that we were undergoing. The thing could not last much longer. I ordered the transports to descend again into the gardens of the Therns. "Wreak your vengeance to the utmost," was my message to the green allies, "for by night there will be none left to avenge your wrongs." Presently I saw the 10 battleships that had been ordered to hold the shaft of Omine. They were returning at full speed, firing their stern batteries almost continually. There could be but one explanation: they were being pursued by another hostile fleet. Well, the situation could be no worse. The expedition already was doomed. No man that had embarked upon it would return across the dreary ice cap. How I wished that I might face Zat Aras with my long sword for just an instant before I died. It was he who had caused our failure. As I watched the oncoming 10, I saw their pursuers race swiftly into sight. It was another great fleet. For a moment I could not believe my eyes, but finally I was forced to admit that the most fatal calamity had overtaken the expedition, for the fleet I saw was none other than the fleet of the firstborn, that should have been safely bottled up in Omine. What a series of misfortunes and disasters! What awful fate hovered over me that I should have been so terribly thwarted at every angle of my search for my lost love? Could it be possible that the curse of Isis was upon me? That there was, indeed, some malign divinity in that hideous carcass? I could not believe it, and throwing back my shoulders, I ran to the deck below to join my men in repelling boarders from one of the Thern craft that had grappled us broadside. In the wild lust of hand-to-hand combat, my old dauntless hopefulness returned, and as Thern after Thern went down beneath my blade, I could almost feel that we should win success in the end, even from apparent failure. My presence among the men so greatly inspirited them that they fell upon the luckless whites with such terrible ferocity that within a few moments we had turned the tables upon them, and a second later, as we swarmed their own decks, I had the satisfaction of seeing their commander take the long leap from the bows of his vessel in token of surrender and defeat. Then I joined Kantos Khan. He had been watching what had taken place on the deck below, and it seemed to have given him a new thought. Immediately he passed an order to one of his officers, and presently the colors of the Prince of Helium broke from every point of the flagship. A great cheer arose from the men of our own ship, a cheer that was taken up by every other vessel of our expedition, as they in turn broke my colors from their upper works. Then Kantos Khan sprang his coup. A signal, legible to every sailor of all the fleets engaged in that fierce struggle, was strung aloft upon the flagship. "Men of Helium, for the Prince of Helium against all his enemies," it read. Presently my colors broke from one of Zat Aras' ships, then from another and another. On some we could see fierce battles waging between the Zodongan soldiery and the heliometric crews. But eventually the colors of the Prince of Helium floated above every ship that had followed Zat Aras upon our trail. Only his flagship flew them not. Zat Aras had brought 5,000 ships. The sky was black with the 3 enormous fleets. It was Helium against the field now, and the fight had settled to countless individual duels. There could be little or no maneuvering of fleets in that crowded, fire-split sky. Zat Aras' flagship was close to my own. I could see the thin features of the man from where I stood. His Zodongan crew was pouring broadside after broadside into us, and we were returning their fire with equal ferocity. Closer and closer came the 2 vessels, until but a few yards intervened. Grapplers and boarders lined the contiguous rails of each. We were preparing for the death struggle with our hated enemy. There was but a yard between the 2 mighty ships as the first grappling irons were hurled. I rushed to the deck to be with my men as they boarded. Just as the vessels came together with a slight shock, I forced my way through the lines, and was the first to spring to the deck of Zadara's ship. After me poured a yelling, cheering, cursing throng of Helium's best fighting men. Nothing could withstand them in the fever of battle lust which enthralled them. Down went the Zodongans before that surging tide of war, and as my men cleared the lower decks, I sprang to the forward deck where stood Zat-Aras. "You are my prisoner, Zat-Aras," I cried. "Yield, and you shall have quarter." For a moment I could not tell whether he contemplated acceding to my demand or facing me with drawn sword. For an instant he stood hesitating, and then, throwing down his arms, he turned and rushed to the opposite side of the deck. Before I could overtake him, he had sprung to the rail and hurled himself head foremost into the awful depths below. And thus came Zat-Aras, Jed of Zodonga, to his end. On and on went that strange battle. The Therns and Blacks had not combined against us. Wherever Thern ship met ship of the firstborn was a battle royal, and in this I thought I saw our salvation. Wherever messages could be passed between us that could not be intercepted by our enemies, I passed the word that all our vessels were to withdraw from the fight as rapidly as possible, taking a position to the west and south of the combatants. I also sent an air scout to the fighting green men in the gardens below to re-embark, and to the transports to join us. My commanders were further instructed that when engaged with an enemy, to draw him as rapidly as possible toward a ship of his hereditary foeman, and by careful maneuvering to force the two to engage, thus leaving himself free to withdraw. This stratagem worked to perfection, and just before the sun went down, I had the satisfaction of seeing all that was left of my once mighty fleet gathered nearly 20 miles southwest of the still terrific battle between the blacks and whites. I now transferred Zodar to another battleship and sent him with all the transports and 5,000 battleships directly overhead to the temple of Isis. Carthoris and I, with Kantos Khan, took the remaining ships and headed for the entrance to Omin. Our plan now was to attempt to make a combined assault upon Isis at dawn of the following day. Tars Tarkas with his green warriors and Horvastus with the red men, guided by Zodar, were to land within the garden of Isis or the surrounding plains, while Carthoris, Kantos Khan, and I were to lead our smaller force from the Sea of Omin through the pits beneath the temple, which Carthoris knew so well. I now learned, for the first time, the cause of my 10 ships' retreat from the mouth of the shaft. It seemed that when they had come upon the shaft, the navy of the firstborn were already issuing from its mouth. Fully 20 vessels had emerged, and though they gave battle immediately in an effort to stem the tide that rolled from the black pit, the odds against them were too great, and they were forced to flee. With great caution, we approached the shaft under cover of darkness. At a distance of several miles, I caused the fleet to be halted, and from there Carthoris went ahead, alone, upon a one-man flyer to reconnoiter. In perhaps half an hour he returned to report that there was no sign of a patrol boat or of the enemy in any form, and so we moved swiftly and noiselessly forward once more toward Omin. At the mouth of the shaft we stopped again for a moment for all the vessels to reach their previously appointed stations. Then, with the flagship, I dropped quickly into the black depths, while one by one the other vessels followed me in quick succession. We had decided to stake all on the chance that we would be able to reach the temple by the subterranean way, and so we left no guard of vessels at the shaft's mouth. Nor would it have profited us any to have done so, for we did not have sufficient force, all told, to have withstood the vast navy of the firstborn had they returned to engage us. For the safety of our entrance upon Omin, we depended largely upon the very boldness of it, believing that it would be some little time before the firstborn on guard there would realize that it was an enemy, and not their own returning fleet, that was entering the vault of the buried sea. And such proved to be the case. In fact, 400 of my fleet of 500 rested safely upon the bosom of Omin before the first shot was fired. The battle was short and hot, but there could have been but one outcome, for the firstborn, in the carelessness of fancied security, had left but a handful of ancient and obsolete hulks to guard their mighty harbor. It was at Carthoris' suggestion that we landed our prisoners under guard upon a couple of the larger islands, and then towed the ships of the firstborn to the shaft, where we managed to wedge a number of them securely in the interior of the great well. Then we turned on the buoyance rays in the balance of them, and let them rise by themselves to further block the passage to Omine as they came into contact with the vessels already lodged there. We now felt that it would be some time at least before the returning firstborn could reach the surface of Omine, and that we would have ample opportunity to make for the subterranean passages which lead to Isis. One of the first steps I took was to hasten personally with a good-sized force to the island of the submarine, which I took without resistance on the part of the small guard there. I found the submarine in its pool, and at once placed a strong guard upon it and the island, where I remained to wait the coming of Carthoris and the others. Among the prisoners was Yersted, commander of the submarine. He recognized me from the 3 trips that I had taken with him during my captivity among the firstborn. "How does it seem," I asked him, "to have the tables turned, to be prisoner of your erstwhile captive?" He smiled, a very grim smile, pregnant with hidden meaning. "It will not be for long, John Carter," he replied. "We have been expecting you, and we are prepared." "So it would appear," I answered, "for you were all ready to become my prisoners with scarce a blow struck on either side." "The fleet must have missed you," he said, "but it will return to Omine, and then that will be a very different matter for John Carter." "I do not know that the fleet has missed me as yet," I said, but of course he did not grasp my meaning, and only looked puzzled. "Many prisoners travel to Isis in your grim craft, Yersted?" I asked. "Very many," he assented. "Might you remember one whom men call Dejathoris?" "Well, indeed, for her great beauty, and then, too, for the fact that she was wife to the first mortal that ever escaped from Isis through all the countless ages of her godhood, and the way that Isis remembers her best, as the wife of one and the mother of another who raised their hands against the goddess of life eternal." I shuddered, for fear of the cowardly revenge that I knew Isis might have taken upon the innocent Dejathoris for the sacrilege of her son and her husband. "And where is Dejathoris now?" I asked, knowing that he would say the words I most dreaded, but yet I loved her so that I could not refrain from hearing even the worst about her fate, so that it fell from the lips of one who had seen her but recently. It was to me as though it brought her closer to me. "Yesterday the monthly rites of Isis were held," replied Yersted, "and I saw her then sitting in her accustomed place at the foot of Isis." "What?" I cried. "She is not dead, then?" "Why, no," replied the black. "It has been no year since she gazed upon the divine glory and the radiant face of—" "No year?" I interrupted. "Why, no," insisted Yersted. "It cannot have been upward of 370 or 80 days." A great light burst upon me. How stupid I had been! I could scarcely retain an outward exhibition of my great joy. Why, I had forgotten the great difference in the length of Martian and earthly years. The 10 earth years I had spent upon Barsoom had encompassed but 5 years and 96 days of Martian time, whose days are 41 minutes longer than ours, and whose years number 687 days. I am in time. I am in time. The words surged through my brain again and again, until at last I must have voiced them audibly, for Yersted shook his head. "In time to save your princess?" he asked, and then, without waiting for my reply, "No, John Carter, Isis will not give up her own. She knows that you are coming, and ere ever a vandal foot is set within the precincts of the temple of Isis, if such a calamity should befall, Dejathoris will be put away forever from the last faint hope of rescue." "You mean that she will be killed merely to thwart me?" I asked. "Not that, other than as a last resort," he replied. "Hast ever heard of the Temple of the Sun?" It is there that they will put her. It lies far within the inner court of the temple of Isis, a little temple that raises a thin spire far above the spires and minarets of the great temple that surrounds it. Beneath it, in the ground, there lies the main body of the temple, consisting in 687 circular chambers, one below another. To each chamber, a single corridor leads through solid rock from the pits of Isis. As the entire temple of the sun revolves once with each revolution of Barsoom about the sun, but once each year does the entrance to each separate chamber come opposite the mouth of the corridor, which forms its only link to the world without. Here Isis puts those who displease her, but whom she does not care to execute forthwith. Or to punish a noble of the firstborn, she may cause him to be placed within a chamber of the temple of the sun for a year. Ofttimes she imprisons an executioner with the condemned, that death may come in a certain horrible form upon a given day. Or again, but enough food is deposited in the chamber to sustain life but the number of days that Isis has allotted for mental anguish. Thus will Dejothoris die, and her fate will be sealed by the first alien foot that crosses the threshold of Isis. So I was to be thwarted in the end. Although I had performed the miraculous and come within a few short moments of my divine princess, yet I was as far from her as when I stood upon the banks of the Hudson, 48 million miles away. End of chapter 20. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 21 of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Through flood and flame. Yersted's information convinced me that there was no time to be lost. I must reach the temple of Isis secretly before the forces under Tarkas assaulted at dawn. Once within its hated walls, I was positive that I could overcome the guards of Isis and bear away my princess, for at my back I would have a force ample for the occasion. No sooner had Carthoris and the others joined me than we commenced the transportation of our men through the submerged passage to the mouth of the gangways which lead from the submarine pool at the temple end of the watery tunnel to the pits of Isis. Many trips were required, but at last all stood safely together again at the beginning of the end of our quest. 5,000 strong we were, all seasoned fighting men of the most warlike race of the red men of Barsoom. As Carthoris alone knew the hidden ways of the tunnels, we could not divide the party and attack the temple at several points at once, as would have been most desirable, and so it was decided that he lead us all as quickly as possible to a point near the temple's center. As we were about to leave the pool and enter the corridor, an officer called my attention to the waters upon which the submarine floated. At first they seemed to be merely agitated, as from the movement of some great body beneath the surface, and I at once conjectured that another submarine was rising to the surface in pursuit of us. But presently it became apparent that the level of the waters was rising, not with extreme rapidity, but very surely, and that soon they would overflow the sides of the pool and submerge the floor of the chamber. For a moment I did not fully grasp the terrible import of the slowly rising water. It was Carthoris who realized the full meaning of the thing, its cause, and the reason for it. "Haste," he cried. "If we delay, we all are lost. The pumps of Omine have been stopped. They would drown us like rats in a trap. We must reach the upper levels of the pits in advance of the flood, or we shall never reach them. Come." "Lead the way, Carthoris," I cried. "We will follow." At my command the youth leaped into one of the corridors, and in column of twos the soldiers followed him in good order, each company entering the corridor only at the command of its dwar or captain. Before the last company filed from the chamber, the water was ankle deep, and that the men were nervous was quite evident. Entirely unaccustomed to water except in quantities sufficient for drinking and bathing purposes, the red Martians instinctively shrank from it in such formidable depths and menacing activity. That they were undaunted while it swirled and eddied about their ankles spoke well for their bravery and their discipline. I was the last to leave the chamber of the submarine, and as I followed the rear of the column toward the corridor, I moved through the water to my knees. The corridor, too, was flooded to the same depth, for its floor was on a level with the floor of the chamber from which it led, nor was there any perceptible rise for many yards. The march of the troops through the corridor was as rapid as was consistent with the number of men that moved through so narrow a passage, but it was not ample to permit us to gain appreciably on the pursuing tide. As the level of the passage rose, so too did the waters rise, until it soon became apparent to me, who brought up the rear, that they were gaining rapidly upon us. I could understand the reason for this, as with the narrowing expanse of Omine, as the waters rose toward the apex of its dome, the rapidity of its rise would increase in inverse ratio to the ever-lessening space to be filled. Long ere the last of the column could hope to reach the upper pits which lay above the danger point, I was convinced that the waters would surge after us in overwhelming volume, and that fully half the expedition would be snuffed out. As I cast about for some means of saving as many as possible of the doomed men, I saw a diverging corridor which seemed to rise at a steep angle at my right. The waters were now swirling about my waist. The men directly before me were quickly becoming panic-stricken. Something must be done at once, or they would rush forward upon their fellows in a mad stampede that would result in trampling down hundreds beneath the flood, and eventually clogging the passage beyond any hope of retreat for those in advance. Raising my voice to its utmost, I shouted my command to the dwarves ahead of me. "Call back the last 25 Utans," I shouted. "Here seems a way of escape. Turn back and follow me." My orders were obeyed by nearer 30 Utans, so that some 3,000 men came about and hastened into the teeth of the flood to reach the corridor up which I directed them. As the first dwarf passed in with his Utan, I cautioned him to listen closely for my commands, and under no circumstances to venture into the open or leave the pits for the temple proper until I should have come up with them, or you know that I died before I could reach you. The officer saluted and left me. The men filed rapidly past me and entered the diverging corridor, which I hoped would lead to safety. The water rose breast-high. Men stumbled, floundered, and went down. Many I grasped and set upon their feet again, but alone the work was greater than I could cope with. Soldiers were being swept beneath the boiling torrent, never to rise. At length the dwarf of the 10th Utan took a stand beside me. He was a valorous soldier, Gur-Tus by name, and together we kept the now thoroughly frightened troops in the semblance of order, and rescued many that would have drowned otherwise. Jor-Kantos, son of Kantos Khan, and a Padwar of the 5th Utan, joined us when his Utan reached the opening through which the men were fleeing. Thereafter not a man was lost of all the hundreds that remained to pass from the main corridor to the branch. As the last Utan was filing past us, the waters had risen until they surged about our necks, but we clasped hands and stood our ground until the last man had passed to the comparative safety of the new passageway. Here we found an immediate and steep ascent, so that within 100 yards we had reached a point above the waters. For a few minutes we continued rapidly up the steep grade, which I hoped would soon bring us quickly to the upper pits that led into the temple of Isis. But I was to meet with a cruel disappointment. Suddenly I heard a cry of "Fire!" far ahead, followed almost at once by cries of terror and the loud commands of dwarves and padwars, who were evidently attempting to direct their men away from some grave danger. At last the report came back to us. "They have fired the pits ahead. We are hemmed in by flames in front and flood behind. Help, John Carter, we are suffocating." And then there swept back upon us at the rear a wave of dense smoke that sent us stumbling and blinded into a choking retreat. There was naught to do other than seek a new avenue of escape. The fire and smoke were to be feared 1,000 times over the water, and so I seized upon the first gallery which led out of and up from the suffocating smoke that was engulfing us. Again I stood to one side while the soldiers hastened through on the new way. Some 2,000 must have passed us at a rapid run when the stream ceased, but I was not sure that all had been rescued who had not passed the point of origin of the flames, and so, to assure myself that no poor devil was left behind to die a horrible death, unsuccored, I ran quickly up the gallery in the direction of the flames, which I could now see burning with a dull glow far ahead. It was hot and stifling work, but at last I reached a point where the fire lit up the corridor sufficiently for me to see that no soldier of helium lay between me and the conflagration. What was in it, or upon the far side, I could not know, nor could any man have passed through that seething hell of chemicals and lived to learn. Having satisfied my sense of duty, I turned and ran rapidly back to the corridor through which my men had passed. To my horror, however, I found that my retreat in this direction had been blocked. Across the mouth of the corridor stood a massive steel grating that had evidently been lowered from its resting place above for the purpose of effectually cutting off my escape. That our principal movements were known to the firstborn, I could not have doubted, in view of the attack of the fleet upon us the day before, nor could the stopping of the pumps of Omine at the psychological moment have been due to chance, nor the starting of a chemical combustion within the one corridor through which we were advancing upon the temple of Isis been due to aught than well-calculated design. And now the dropping of the steel gate to pen me effectually between fire and flood seemed to indicate that invisible eyes were upon us at every moment. What chance had I then to rescue Dejathoris, were I to be compelled to fight foes who never showed themselves? 1,000 times I berated myself for being drawn into such a trap, as I might have known these pits easily could be. Now I saw that it would have been much better to have kept our force intact, and made a concerted attack upon the temple from the valley side, trusting to chance and our great fighting ability to have overwhelmed the firstborn and compelled the safe delivery of Dejathoris to me. The smoke from the fire was forcing me further and further back down the corridor toward the waters which I could hear surging through the darkness. With my men had gone the last torch, nor was this corridor lighted by the radiance of phosphorescent rock, as were those of the lower levels. It was this fact that assured me that I was not far from the upper pits which lie directly beneath the temple. Finally, I felt the lapping waters about my feet. The smoke was thick behind me. My suffering was intense. There seemed but one thing to do, and that, to choose the easier death which confronted me. And so I moved on down the corridor until the cold waters of Omine closed about me, and I swam on through utter blackness toward what? The instinct of self-preservation is strong, even when one, unafraid and in the possession of his highest reasoning faculties, knows that death, positive and unalterable, lies just ahead. And so I swam slowly on, waiting for my head to touch the top of the corridor, which would mean that I had reached the limit of my flight and the point where I must sink forever to an unmarked grave. But, to my surprise, I ran against a blank wall before I reached a point where the waters came to the roof of the corridor. Could I be mistaken? I felt around. No, I had come to the main corridor, and still there was a breathing space between the surface of the water and the rocky ceiling above. And then I turned up the main corridor in the direction the Carthoris and the head of the column had passed a half-hour before. On and on I swam, my heart growing lighter at every stroke, for I knew that I was approaching closer and closer to the point where there would be no chance that the waters ahead could be deeper than they were about me. I was positive that I must soon feel the solid floor beneath my feet again, and that once more my chance would come to reach the temple of Isis and the side of the fair prisoner who languished there. But even as hope was at its highest, I felt the sudden shock of contact as my head struck the rocks above. The worst then had come to me. I had reached one of those rare places where a Martian tunnel dips suddenly to a lower level. Somewhere beyond, I knew that it rose again, but of what value was that to me, since I did not know how great the distance that it maintained a level entirely beneath the surface of the water? There was but a single forlorn hope, and I took it. Filling my lungs with air, I dived beneath the surface, and swam through the inky, icy blackness on and on along the submerged gallery. Time and time again I rose with upstretched hand, only to feel the disappointing rocks close above me. Not for much longer would my lungs withstand the strain upon them. I felt that I must soon succumb, nor was there any retreating now that I had gone this far. I knew positively that I could never endure to retrace my path now to the point from which I had felt the waters close above my head. Death stared me in the face, nor ever can I recall a time that I so distinctly felt the icy breath from his dead lips upon my brow. One more frantic effort I made with my fast-ebbing strength. Weakly I rose for the last time. My tortured lungs gasped for the breath that would fill them with a strange and numbing element. But instead, I felt the revivifying breath of life-giving air surge through my starving nostrils into my dying lungs. I was saved. A few more strokes brought me to a point where my feet touched the floor, and soon thereafter I was above the water level entirely, racing like mad along the corridor, searching for the first doorway that would lead me to Isis. If I could not have Dejathoris again, I was at least determined to avenge her death, nor would any life satisfy me other than that of the fiend incarnate who was the cause of such immeasurable suffering upon Barsoom. Sooner than I had expected, I came to what appeared to me to be a sudden exit into the temple above. It was at the right side of the corridor, which ran on probably to other entrances to the pile above. To me, one point was as good as another. What knew I where any of them led? And so, without waiting to be again discovered and thwarted, I ran quickly up the short, steep incline and pushed open the doorway at its end. The portal swung slowly in, and before it could be slammed against me, I sprang into the chamber beyond. Although not yet dawn, the room was brilliantly lighted. Its sole occupant lay prone upon a low couch at the further side, apparently in sleep. From the hangings and sumptuous furniture of the room, I judged it to be a living room of some priestess, possibly of Isis herself. At the thought, the blood tingled through my veins. What, indeed, if fortune had been kind enough to place the hideous creature alone and unguarded in my hands? With her as hostage, I could force acquiescence to my every demand. Cautiously, I approached the recumbent figure on noiseless feet. Closer and closer I came to it, but I had crossed but little more than half the chamber when the figure stirred, and, as I sprang, rose and faced me. At first, an expression of terror overspread the features of the woman who confronted me, then startled incredulity, hope, thanksgiving. My heart pounded within my breast as I advanced toward her. Tears came to my eyes, and the words that would have poured forth in a perfect torrent choked in my throat as I opened my arms and took into them once more the woman I loved, Dejathoris, Princess of Helium. End of chapter 21. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 22 of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Victory and Defeat. John Carter, John Carter, she sobbed, with her dear head upon my shoulder. Even now I can scarcely believe the witness of my own eyes. When the girl, Thuvia, told me that you had returned to Barsoom, I listened, but I could not understand, for it seemed that such happiness would be impossible for one who had suffered so in silent loneliness for all these long years. At last, when I realized that it was the truth, and then came to know the awful place in which I was held prisoner, I learned to doubt that even you could reach me here. As the days passed, and moon after moon went by without bringing even the faintest rumor of you, I resigned myself to my fate, and now that you have come, scarce can I believe it. For an hour I have heard the sounds of conflict within the palace. I knew not what they meant, but I have hoped against hope that it might be the men of Helium, headed by my prince. And tell me, what of Carthoris, our son?" "He was with me less than an hour since, Dejothoris," I replied. "It must have been he whose men you have heard battling within the precincts of the temple." "Where is Isis?" I asked suddenly. Dejothoris shrugged her shoulders. "She sent me under guard to this room just before the fighting began within the temple halls. She said that she would send for me later. She seemed very angry and somewhat fearful. Never have I seen her act in so uncertain and almost terrified a manner. Now I know that it must have been because she had learned that John Carter, Prince of Helium, was approaching to demand an accounting of her for the imprisonment of his princess." The sounds of conflict, the clash of arms, the shouting, and the hurrying of many feet came to us from various parts of the temple. I knew that I was needed there, but I dared not leave Dejothoris, nor dared I take her with me into the turmoil and danger of battle. At last I bethought me of the pits from which I had just emerged. Why not secrete her there, until I could return and fetch her away in safety, and forever, from this awful place? I explained my plan to her. For a moment she clung more closely to me. "I cannot bear to be parted from you now, even for a moment, John Carter," she said. "I shudder at the thought of being alone again, where that terrible creature might discover me. You do not know her. None can imagine her ferocious cruelty who has not witnessed her daily acts for over half a year. It has taken me nearly all this time to realize even the things that I have seen with my own eyes." "I shall not leave you then, my princess," I replied. She was silent for a moment. Then she drew my face to hers and kissed me. "Go, John Carter," she said. "Our son is there, and the soldiers of Helium, fighting for the princess of Helium. Where they are, you should be. I must not think of myself now, but of them, and of my husband's duty. I may not stand in the way of that. Hide me in the pits, and go." I led her to the door through which I had entered the chamber from below. There I pressed her dear form to me. And then, though it tore my heart to do it, and filled me only with the blackest shadows of terrible foreboding, I guided her across the threshold, kissed her once again, and closed the door upon her. Without hesitating longer, I hurried from the chamber in the direction of the greatest tumult. Scarce half a dozen chambers had I traversed before I came upon the theater of a fierce struggle. The blacks were massed at the entrance to a great chamber, where they were attempting to block the further progress of a body of red men toward the inner sacred precincts of the temple. Coming from within as I did, I found myself behind the blacks, and without waiting to even calculate their numbers or the foolhardiness of my venture, I charged swiftly across the chamber and fell upon them from the rear with my keen longsword. As I struck the first blow, I cried aloud, "For Helium!" And then I rained cut after cut upon the surprised warriors, while the Reds without took heart at the sound of my voice, and with shouts of "John Carter! John Carter!" redoubled their efforts so effectually that before the blacks could recover from their temporary demoralization, their ranks were broken, and the red men had burst into the chamber. The fight within that room, had it had but a competent chronicler, would go down in the annals of Barsoom as a historic memorial to the grim ferocity of her warlike people. 500 men fought there that day, the black men against the red. No man asked quarter or gave it. As though by common assent they fought, as though to determine once and for all their right to live, in accordance with the law of the survival of the fittest. I think we all knew that upon the outcome of this battle would hinge forever the relative positions of these two races upon Barsoom. It was a battle between the old and the new, but not for once did I question the outcome of it. With Carthoris at my side, I fought for the red men of Barsoom, and for their total emancipation from the throttling bondage of a hideous superstition. Back and forth across the room we surged, until the floor was ankle-deep in blood, and dead men lay so thickly there that half the time we stood upon their bodies as we fought. As we swung toward the great windows which overlooked the gardens of Isis, a sight met my gaze which sent a wave of exultation over me. "Look!" I cried. "Men of the firstborn, look!" For an instant the fighting ceased, and with one accord every eye turned in the direction I had indicated, and the sight they saw was one no man of the firstborn had ever imagined could be. Across the gardens, from side to side, stood a wavering line of black warriors, while beyond them, and forcing them ever back, was a great horde of green warriors astride their mighty thoats. And as we watched, one, fiercer and more grimly terrible than his fellows, rode forward from the rear, and as he came he shouted some fierce command to his terrible legion. It was Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and as he couched his great 40-foot metal-shod lance, we saw his warriors do likewise. Then it was that we interpreted his command. 20 yards now separated the green men from the black line. Another word from the great Thark, and with a wild and terrifying battle cry, the green warriors charged. For a moment the black line held, but only for a moment. Then the fearsome beasts that bore equally terrible riders passed completely through it. After them came utan upon utan of red men. The green horde broke to surround the temple. The red men charged for the interior, and then we turned to continue our interrupted battle. But our foes had vanished. My first thought was of Dejathoras. Calling to Carthoris that I had found his mother, I started on a run toward the chamber where I had left her, with my boy close beside me. After us came those of our little force who had survived the bloody conflict. The moment I entered the room, I saw that someone had been there since I had left. A silk lay upon the floor. It had not been there before. There were also a dagger and several metal ornaments strewn about, as though torn from their wearer in a struggle. But worst of all, the door leading to the pits where I had hidden my princess was ajar. With a bound I was before it, and thrusting it open, rushed within. Dejathoras had vanished. I called her name aloud again and again, but there was no response. I think in that instant I hovered on the verge of insanity. I do not recall what I said or did, but I know that for an instant I was seized with the rage of a maniac. "Isis!" I cried. "Isis! Where is Isis? Search the temple for her, but let no man harm her but John Carter. Carthoris, where are the apartments of Isis?" "This way," cried the boy, and without waiting to know that I had heard him, he dashed off at breakneck speed further into the bowels of the temple. As fast as he went, however, I was still beside him, urging him on to greater speed. At last we came to a great carved door, and through this Carthoris dashed, a foot ahead of me. Within we came upon such a scene as I had witnessed within the temple once before: the throne of Isis, with the reclining slaves, and about it the ranks of soldiery. We did not even give the men a chance to draw, so quickly were we upon them. With a single cut I struck down 2 in the front rank, and then, by the mere weight and momentum of my body, I rushed completely through the 2 remaining ranks, and sprang upon the dais beside the carved Sorapus throne. The repulsive creature, squatting there in terror, attempted to escape me and leap into a trap behind her, but this time I was not to be outwitted by any such petty subterfuge. Before she had half risen, I had grasped her by the arm, and then, as I saw the guards starting to make a concerted rush upon me from all sides, I whipped out my dagger, and holding it close to that vile breast, ordered them to halt. "Back!" I cried to them. "Back! The first black foot that is planted upon this platform sends my dagger into Isis' heart." For an instant they hesitated. Then an officer ordered them back, while from the outer corridor there swept into the throne room, at the heels of my little party of survivors, a full 1,000 red men under Kantos Khan, Horvastus, and Zodar. "Where is Dejathoras?" I cried to the thing within my hands. For a moment her eyes roved wildly about the scene beneath her. I think that it took a moment for the true condition to make any impression upon her. She could not at first realize that the temple had fallen before the assault of men of the outer world. When she did, there must have come, too, a terrible realization of what it meant to her, the loss of power, humiliation, the exposure of the fraud and imposture which she had for so long played upon her own people. There was just one thing needed to complete the reality of the picture she was seeing, and that was added by the highest noble of her realm, the high priest of her religion, the prime minister of her government. "Isis, goddess of death and of life eternal," he cried, "arise in the might of thy righteous wrath, and with one single wave of thy omnipotent hand strike dead thy blasphemers. Let not one escape. Isis, thy people depend upon thee. Daughter of the lesser moon, thou only art all-powerful. Thou only canst save thy people. I am done. We await thy will. Strike!" And then it was that she went mad. A screaming, gibbering maniac writhed in my grasp. It bit and clawed and scratched in impotent fury. And then it laughed, a weird and terrible laughter that froze the blood. The slave girls upon the dais shrieked and cowered away, and the thing jumped at them and gnashed its teeth, and then spat upon them from frothing lips. God, but it was a horrid sight. Finally I shook the thing, hoping to recall it for a moment to rationality. "Where is Dejathoris?" I cried again. The awful creature in my grasp mumbled inarticulately for a moment, then a sudden gleam of cunning shot into those hideous, close-set eyes. "Dejathoris? Dejathoris?" And then that shrill, unearthly laugh pierced our ears once more. "Yes, Dejathoris, I know, and Thuvia, and Fedor, daughter of Matashang. They each love John Carter. Ha! But it is droll. Together for a year they will meditate within the temple of the sun. But ere the year is quite gone, there will be no more food for them. Ho, ho, what divine entertainment!" And she licked the froth from her cruel lips. "There will be no more food except each other. Ha, ha, ha." The horror of the suggestion nearly paralyzed me. To this awful fate the creature within my power had condemned my princess. I trembled in the ferocity of my rage. As a terrier shakes a rat, I shook Isis, goddess of life eternal. "Countermand your orders," I cried. "Recall the condemned. Haste, or you die." "It is too late. Ha, ha, ha." And then she commenced her gibbering and shrieking again. Almost of its own volition, my dagger flew up above that putrid heart, but something stayed my hand, and I am now glad that it did. It were a terrible thing to have struck down a woman with one's own hand, but a fitter fate occurred to me for this false deity. "Firstborn," I cried, turning to those who stood within the chamber, "you have seen today the impotency of Isis. The gods are impotent. Isis is no god. She is a cruel and wicked old woman who has deceived and played upon you for ages. Take her. John Carter, Prince of Helium, would not contaminate his hand with her blood." And with that I pushed the raving beast, whom a short half-hour before a whole world had worshipped as divine, from the platform of her throne into the waiting clutches of her betrayed and vengeful people. Spying Zodar among the officers of the Red Men, I called him to lead me quickly to the Temple of the Sun, and without waiting to learn what fate the firstborn would wreak upon their goddess, I rushed from the chamber with Zodar, Carthoris, Horvastus, Kantos Khan, and a score of other red nobles. The black led us rapidly through the inner chambers of the temple until we stood within the central court, a great circular space paved with a transparent marble of exquisite whiteness. Before us rose a golden temple wrought in the most wondrous and fanciful designs, inlaid with diamond, ruby, sapphire, turquoise, emerald, and the thousand nameless gems of Mars, which far transcend in loveliness and purity of ray the most priceless stones of earth. "This way," cried Zodar, leading us toward the entrance to a tunnel which opened in the courtyard beside the temple. Just as we were on the point of descending, we heard a deep-toned roar burst from the temple of Isis, which we had but just quitted, and then a red man, Diorcantos, Padwar of the fifth Utan, broke from a nearby gate, crying to us to return. "The blacks have fired the temple," he cried. "In 1,000 places it is burning now. Haste to the outer gardens, or you are lost." As he spoke, we saw smoke pouring from a dozen windows looking out upon the courtyard of the Temple of the Sun, and far above the highest minaret of Isis hung an ever-growing pall of smoke. "Go back, go back," I cried to those who had accompanied me. "The way, Zodar, point the way and leave me. I shall reach my princess yet." "Follow me, John Carter," replied Zodar, and without waiting for my reply, he dashed down into the tunnel at our feet. At his heels I ran down through a half-dozen tiers of galleries, until at last he led me along a level floor, at the end of which I discerned a lighted chamber. Massive bars blocked our further progress, but beyond I saw her, my incomparable princess, and with her were Thuvia and Fedor. When she saw me, she rushed toward the bars that separated us. Already the chamber had turned upon its slow way so far that but a portion of the opening in the temple wall was opposite the barred end of the corridor. Slowly the interval was closing. In a short time there would be but a tiny crack, and then even that would be closed, and for a long Barsoomian year the chamber would slowly revolve until once more, for a brief day, the aperture in its wall would pass the corridor's end. But in the meantime, what horrible things would go on within that chamber? "Zodar," I cried, "can no power stop this awful revolving thing? Is there none who holds the secret of these terrible bars?" "None, I fear, whom we could fetch in time, though I shall go and make the attempt. Wait for me here." After he had left, I stood and talked with Dejathoris, and she stretched her dear hand through those cruel bars, that I might hold it until the last moment. Thuvia and Fedor came close also, but when Thuvia saw that we would be alone, she withdrew to the further side of the chamber. Not so the daughter of Matachan. "John Carter," she said, "this be the last time that you shall see any of us. Tell me that you love me, that I may die happy." "I love only the Princess of Helium," I replied quietly. "I am sorry, Fedor, but it is as I have told you from the beginning." She bit her lip and turned away, but not before I saw the black and ugly scowl she turned upon Dejathoris. Thereafter she stood a little way apart, but not so far as I should have desired, for I had many little confidences to impart to my long-lost love. For a few minutes we stood thus talking in low tones. Ever smaller and smaller grew the opening. In a short time now it would be too small even to permit the slender form of my princess to pass. Oh, why did not Zodar haste? Above we could hear the faint echoes of a great tumult. It was the multitude of black and red and green men fighting their way through the fire from the burning temple of Isis. A draught from above brought the fumes of smoke to our nostrils. As we stood waiting for Zodar, the smoke became thicker and thicker. Presently we heard shouting at the end of the corridor, and hurrying feet. "Come back, John Carter, come back," cried a voice. "Even the pits are burning." In a moment a dozen men broke through the now blinding smoke to my side. There was Carthoris, and Kantos Khan, and Horvastus, and Zodar, with a few more who had followed me to the temple court. "There is no hope, John Carter," cried Zodar. "The keeper of the keys is dead, and his keys are not upon his carcass. Our only hope is to quench this conflagration and trust to fate that a year will find your princess alive and well. I have brought sufficient food to last them. When this crack closes, no smoke can reach them, and if we hasten to extinguish the flames, I believe they will be safe." "Go then, yourself, and take these others with you," I replied. "I shall remain here beside my princess until a merciful death releases me from my anguish. I care not to live." As I spoke, Zodar had been tossing a great number of tiny cans within the prison cell. The remaining crack was not over an inch in width a moment later. Dejah stood as close to it as she could, whispering words of hope and courage to me, and urging me to save myself. Suddenly, beyond her, I saw the beautiful face of Fedor contorted into an expression of malign hatred. As my eyes met hers, she spoke. "Think not, John Carter, that you may so lightly cast aside the love of Fedor, daughter of Matasham, nor ever hope to hold thy Dejah Thoris in thy arms again. Wait you the long, long year, but know that when the waiting is over, it shall be Fedor's arms which shall welcome you, not those of the Princess of Helium. Behold, she dies." And as she finished speaking, I saw her raise a dagger on high, and then I saw another figure. It was Thuvia's. As the dagger fell toward the unprotected breast of my love, Thuvia was almost between them. A blinding gust of smoke blotted out the tragedy within that fearsome cell. A shriek rang out, a single shriek, as the dagger fell. The smoke cleared away, but we stood gazing upon a blank wall. The last crevice had closed, and for a long year that hideous chamber would retain its secret from the eyes of men. They urged me to leave. "In a moment it will be too late," cried Zodar. "There is, in fact, but a bare chance that we can come through to the outer garden alive even now. I have ordered the pumps started, and in 5 minutes the pits will be flooded. If we would not drown like rats in a trap, we must hasten above and make a dash for safety through the burning temple." "Go," I urged them. "Let me die here beside my princess. There is no hope or happiness elsewhere for me. When they carry her dear body from that terrible place a year hence, let them find the body of her lord awaiting her." Of what happened after that, I have only a confused recollection. It seems as though I struggled with many men, and then that I was picked bodily from the ground and borne away. I do not know. I have never asked, nor has any other who was there that day intruded on my sorrow, or recalled to my mind the occurrences which they know could but at best reopen the terrible wound within my heart. Ah, if I could but know one thing, what a burden of suspense would be lifted from my shoulders. But whether the assassin's dagger reached one fair bosom or another, only time will divulge. End of chapter 22. Recording by Thomas Copeland. End of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs.